My name is Andrew Smith and I work for Campaign Against the Arms Trade, and today I'm going to talk to you about the sale of tear gas and other small arms to repressive police forces around the world. It's a particularly topical theme because we've seen the horrific footage which has come from across the United States of police forces using tear gas, using rubber bullets, using other weaponry to indiscriminately attack crowds of campaigners in the aftermath of the brutal and racist murder of George Floyd. The scenes which we've seen have been horrific and they've been rightly condemned around the world. But there's every possibility that many of the weapons which are being used against activists, being used against citizens, are coming from here in the UK, because the UK government is one of the largest arms exporters in the world, and the US is one of the largest buyers of UK weapons in the world. We know that over recent years there have been multiple licenses granted for the sale of tear gas and the sale of rubber bullets and other kind of crowd control equipment. And that is the same kind of equipment which is being used by police forces all across the United States. And what we have seen in ways of response is widespread condemnation from MPs, with 166 MPs signing a letter to urge the government to end these arms sales, to suspend these licenses and investigate if UK-made weapons had been used aggressively against protesters and against campaigners. And so far the government's response has been incredibly weak. It's also been incredibly predictable. They've given us the same tired old line that they always use about how rigorous and robust UK arms export controls supposedly are. But in reality, nothing could be further from the truth. In theory, the arms controls should work. In theory, they're very clear. They say that weapons should not be sold if it could be used for internal repression. What we're seeing when we look on the news right now is widespread internal repression in the US using the exact same sorts of weapons which the UK is exporting. By any common sense understanding, that should prohibit those sales. That should stop tear gas from being exported. That should stop the export of rubber bullets. But instead, we're having the same banal reassurances from Boris Johnson about how rigorous the system supposedly is. But part of the reason for this is because the UK government is currently in negotiations to sign a major new trade deal with the US, and I expect they're putting that trade deal ahead of the human rights, ahead of the lives of campaigners in the United States. And this isn't just an issue in regard to the US either. The UK sells tear gas all around the world. In fact, there's over 50 countries which have bought UK-made tear gas over the last decade, and these include some of the most repressive regimes in the world, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Bahrain, and whether it's Egypt. In fact, we know that the Egyptian authorities have used UK-made tear gas on campaigners before. We saw that during the uprisings in 2011, when UK-made tear gas was used against campaigners. We saw it happening in Hong Kong in 2014 when the Hong Kong authorities used UK-made tear gas against pro-democracy campaigners. In the case of Hong Kong, the government said that it would reconsider its policy in light of the attacks on civilians, but it didn't change anything. 1 year later, they were back to selling the exact same kind of tear gas. And of course, we all saw last summer when that tear gas was put to effect. We saw the Hong Kong police using indiscriminate attacks against the umbrella movement, with UK-made tear gas being a part of those attacks. So it wasn't just a case of the government failing to learn from its policies, it was a case of the government failing to implement its policies and carrying on regardless. And that is irrespective of the atrocities which had already been committed. Because these arms sales haven't happened by accident. This is part of a policy from government. There is, in fact, a department of the civil service called the Defence and Security Organisation. It's part of the Department of International Trade. It's not a very well-known department itself. And it exists for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to maximise arms sales. It does everything it can to work hand in hand with arms dealers, with arms company executives, to try to encourage foreign governments to buy as much weaponry as possible. And one of the ways they do this is through the organisation of major arms fairs. You may be familiar with the Defence and Security Equipment International, which is the biggest arms fair in Europe. It happens in London every 2 years, and it'll be returning to London next September, COVID allowing. And we'll be there to protest against it. We'll be there to take action against it, because when arms fairs like this take place, they bring many of the most repressive regimes in the world to the UK, and they bring all of the world's biggest arms companies. And the reason they're there is to thrift as many weapons as possible. So buyers will be able to buy tear gas, will be able to buy rubber bullets, will be able to buy assault rifles, will be able to buy all sorts of weaponry. Many of the tools of repression are being directly promoted by our government. And that is central to the rank hypocrisy that is at the heart of UK foreign policy. Because even though there are rhetorical restrictions, those restrictions are very often completely and utterly ignored. And we've seen over recent years where the courts have had to intervene. In the case of UK arms exports to Saudi Arabia for use in Yemen, we now know that those were not just immoral, they've also been illegal, with UK-made fighter jets, bombs and missiles playing a key role in that war. And it's the same policy of arms sales at all cost, which explains why repressive police forces around the world are being armed and supported by the UK government, despite all of its rhetoric about the importance of human rights and freedom and democracy. Because ultimately, when push comes to shove, the priority is always the same thing, and that priority is arms company profits. And ultimately, that is what is underpinning this drive to continue selling tear gas, to continue selling rubber bullets, to continue selling all sorts of weapons which could be used against protesters and campaigners, because these weapons don't just provide support to authoritarian states, they don't just provide the weapons themselves, they also provide a clear level of political support for the regime that is buying them. The message it sends very loudly and clearly to the buyer is one of total support. But the message it sends to people who are on the receiving end of those abuses, whether it is the families of campaigners who have been locked up, whether it is campaigners who are being attacked and beaten by authoritarian states, the message it sends to them is that their human rights don't matter, that their lives don't matter, and that their rights are of less importance than profits for arms companies. And this has been the case for decades and decades. The UK government has managed to make itself one of the largest arms exporters in the world. And the way it has done that is by constantly turning the other way when it comes to human rights, by constantly turning the other way when it comes to brutality and repression like what we have seen on the streets of the US. And of course, this isn't just an issue which happens over there. This is not just an American issue. It's not just an issue for people in Hong Kong. One of the reasons why the murder of George Floyd has had such an impact around the world is because so many of the themes that it links to will be familiar to millions of people all around the world, including here in the UK, where the police force has had a long history of racism, where there have been years of failure to be held accountable for deaths in police custody, where there has been years of repression against protesters, repression against campaigners. And that's one of the reasons why I think that it has had such a major impact. And it may have been appalling, but to many people it won't have been shocking. And the UK has helped to enable the repression which has come with it, not just through the sale of tear gas and through the political support for the US state and the police, but also through its total inaction over recent weeks by the fact that it has allowed these sales to continue, by the fact that it has stood by firmly with Donald Trump and the police authorities across the US. We've heard very tokenistic condemnation, but we haven't seen any actions. And the decisions which are made here in the UK will have repercussions around the world as well. And when weapons are sold, we don't know what atrocities they could be used in the future. We don't know what abuses they could be used in the future. We don't know what repression they could be used in the future. And that is why we need to take action. That is why we need to do all we can here in the UK to hold our government accountable, not just for its repressive domestic policies, not just for the structural racism which it has overseen at home, but also for the consequences of its arms exports abroad, also for the consequences of the political support which it has and the political credibility which it has given to authoritarian regimes around the world. Because it should not take a police murder to put these issues in the news. It should not take a widespread repression to make the government reconsider its policies. We can't get to a point where we have arms control by embarrassment. Arms controls have to be in the first place to stop these weapons from being exported in the first place. And that's why we need to continue to hold our government accountable, as well as standing in solidarity of activists in the US, as well as standing support of activists all across the US. We also have to hold this government accountable for the decisions it made, for the actions it has taken, for the actions it has not taken. Because ultimately, there's a choice to be made. You're either on the side of the campaigners, or you're on the side of the police force which is attacking them with tear gas and batons and rubber bullets. You're either on the side of those who are campaigning for justice, or you're on the side of the authoritarian regimes around the world who are doing everything they can to stop them. We know whose side we're on, and unfortunately the UK government has shown time and again which side it is on as well. And that's why we urge you to take action. That's why we urge you to get involved in your local CAAT group, why we urge you to support progressive groups all across the UK, whether it's CAAT or whether it is London CND. We are all part of one movement, and we need to act together, because when we act together, we can achieve so much more than we can alone. Thank you very much for listening.